Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 32, The Coach Driver. This episode is based on my husband's 3 times great-grandfather, Charles Lewis Lee, known as Charlie. Charlie was born in 1841 in London, based on his death certificate information. His marriage certificate, though, makes his birth year as 1848. I cannot find a definitive immigration record for Charlie. However, an article mentions that he started his working life in Australia in Tasmania. In his obituary, the family stated that in about 1865, at the age of 24, he was employed by T.J. Gass, then for Cobb Co, to drive the mail coach from Deniliquin to Moama in New South Wales. After the railway line, he did the Deniliquin to Hay, New South Wales run. So there are a couple of articles that do glean a little bit of the early life of Charlie. The first one is about the Cobb Co drivers. The drivers of the coaches were a very fine body of men. The best and most resourceful were employed on the Deniliquin road. Of these, some of the most notable were Charlie Lee, Matt Hull, Matt Thornton and Bill Keast. Of these, Charlie Lee was the most experienced. He had been driving between Hobart and Launceston before he came to the Riverina. He drove the coach right through from Hay to Deniliquin before the railway was opened during the flood years of 1867 to 1870. And his skill and courage was so greatly appreciated that in 1868 he was presented by the pastoralists of Deniliquin and Hay with a gold watch and chain, which he wore to the day of his death not long ago, and which I believe his son, Mr. Charles Lee of Park Estate, Barubin, still wears. This was the most single form of recognition I ever knew of a coach driver received at the hands of the public. Charlie Lee was one of the most successful drivers that Cobb Co ever had. Charlie Lee selected land near Barubin whilst he was still driving and worked it and added to it and died a comparatively wealthy man. Another article mentions the background to Cobb Co. Watson and Hewitt, who were also mail contractors of the olden time, bought out the Victorian Stagecoach Company and took over the line to Echuca. And after a while, Robertson, Wagner and Co. bought out Watson and Hewitt and became the consolidated Cobb Co. of northwestern Victoria and southwestern Riverina. In or about the year of 1865, the present veteran manager of the company, Mr. Morris Parker, was appointed to the charge of the system, with its headquarters at Deniliquin. And while the coach was the acme of comfort to the traveller and the driver the king of the road, Charlie Lee was then connected with the firm. For years after Robertson, Wagner and Co. ran their coaches from Echuca to Deniliquin, there was no terminus in the far interior beyond Hay, which was then known as Lang's Crossing on the Murrumbidgee. As the southwestern Riverina became populated, the coaching business of the firm developed, and by the year of the big flood in 1870, ramifications of the business were largely extended. In addition to the Echuca and Hay service, the company acquired tenders for Jerilderie and Balranald, from Balranald to Hay and Ivanhoe, from Hay to Hillston, and from Hay to Balligal, Wilcannia and Mount Brown, besides several other lines of minor importance. The arrival of a coach in Deniliquin in those days was looked forward to, as people now watch for a train in the backcountry township. The best team on the road was reserved for the home section, and when the gaudily painted coach with its flashing lights, its foaming horses, its king of a driver, dashed up to the office, every boy was jealous and inwardly vowed that the noblest calling in the world was that of the Cobb Co's whip. And an article in 1942 talking about the early days says, Mr. Charles Lee of Park Estate, Barubin, is one of the oldest coaching identities of the district. In these days of petrol restrictions, the horse is coming into its own again to a limited extent, limited by the amount of horse flesh, harness and gear available, and of the ability and patience of present-day drivers. The following article from the Pastoral Times in 1867 says, Picnic. It was a scorching hot day for the annual picnic on Tuesday on the sandbank opposite the old bank. Almost 400 were present. About 4 p.m, Cobb's coach arrived, drawn by 8 horses, driven by that matchless whip, Charlie Lee. The horses, a splendid team, were gaily decorated in ribbons, Anne Lee, by skill and nerve, cut a complete figure 8 on the sandhill around the buoys and bushes to the astonishment of all beholders. After accomplishing this feat, Lee went homeward in a style not to be surpassed. The Charlie Lee referred to had a wonderful reputation as a driver of coaches, but we wonder if a similar feat by a youngster with a motorcar would land him before the bench on a dangerous driving charge. There's also a legendary story of the outback headless horseman and the trotting cob. The legend arose when a drover named Doyle died at Black Swamp in the early 1850s. The drovers would tell of having seen, while camping at Black Swamp, the ghost of Doyle on a cob horse, riding about the camp at night, a cloak wrapped around him but without a head. Charlie claimed he saw the headless horseman in action, and when Charlie died in 1929, the legend of the trotting cob lost its greatest champion. The legend was said to have continued by a Moolameen butcher who, outfitted as the headless ghost, would spook drovers' mobs and make off with cattle to trade through his shop. He was said to toss a cape over his shoulders to hide a wooden frame, giving the appearance of the base of a neck but with no head. He limited his thefts to small numbers to avoid attention and continued his game until fencing in one of the runs made illicit movement of stock too difficult. Other stories told of how cattle were charged and taken south across the border and sold. One Cobb Co driver claimed to have taken an injured cattle thief to hospital only to see the same thief's headless body riding a horse a few nights later. Overlanders dreaded camping at the swamp, believing the sight of the apparitions spelt their doom. In 1915, there was an article in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Press about a man that had been overland on a trip in 1871, and part of his trip he camped at Black Swamp. And he said, "We now had the old man plain before us, and after resting at Wanganella on the Billabong during the heat of the day, proceeded for the Black Swamp for our night camp. The plain at this time was covered with salt and cotton bush. To cross it in the daytime was weary, monotonous work, but on a moonlit night it had a certain charm. A light breeze would cause the saltbush to wave like a gentle ripple on the ocean, and the occasional ridges of pine jutting out reminded me of one of the headlands, and 'twas not great tax on the imagination to fancy one down by the deep sad sea. Soon after we were settled in camp, Billy O'Hare observed that this portion of the Old Man Plain was reported to be haunted. But surely, said Mr. Hannaford, you have no ghosts or superstition in a young country like Australia. I know, said O'Hare, that some of the drovers avoid this camp, although it's the best between Deniliquin and Hay. Would tell us all about it, said Mr. Hannaford. How did the tale originate? I do not know, but it is said that the apparition is known as the Headless Horseman of the Black Swamp. One drover told seriously that on one occasion the cattle stampeded, and in the distance he saw a white object on a white horse, and that he would have made after it but for the trouble with the cattle. And do you believe him? Asked Mr. Hannaford. Yes, he replied. Then how do you account for it? And he said, why, I believe it to be a hoax practised by some stockman or resident in this part to keep the drovers from camping here, and a very plausible solution of the mystery. In 1951, there was an article in The Land, a Sydney newspaper, and it says, the Headless Horseman of Black Swamp. Way back in the 1870s, the Black Swamp on the road between Deniliquin and Hay had a bad reputation with cattle drovers, though drovers of sheep did not mind camping there because sheep do not stampede as readily as cattle. The camp was supposed to be haunted by a headless horseman who rode a headless horse. Hard-bitten stockmen who did not believe in ghosts had their cattle stampeded from this camp, and when the cattle were rounded up after daylight, it was always found that a fair number of cattle out of any big mob were missing. Some drovers who did not believe in the supernatural actually saw a headless horseman mounted on a headless horse galloping into the mob and causing a stampede. It was impossible, but it happened, they say. One drover, Ned Quinn, who believed there was a natural explanation for any seemingly supernatural happening, galloped alongside the headless horseman and tried to pull him out of his saddle. Instead of achieving his object, he himself was unhorsed by a terrific punch in the jaw. The Headless Horseman went out of business in the 80s of the last century because drovers, even if non-believers in the supernatural, arranged their stages so that they would not have to camp at the Black Swamp. The mystery remained unsolved until the late 90s, and an old man who was dying in a hospital in northern Victoria told the hospital authorities, truthfully or otherwise, that he was the Headless Horseman. He explained that he wore light coloured clothing and blackened his face and head, making them practically invisible at night. His black horse appeared headless, he said, because it was whitewashed all over, with the exception of its head, which was very hard to see on a dark night. Mates of his, he explained, picked up fair numbers of cattle from every scattered herd and had their own ways of disposing of them. The dying man's story may have been an invention, but no other explanation of the headless horseman has ever been put forward. In 1970, the Windurin Shire unveiled a marker telling the story, which stands there today. Charlie met Clara Caroline Jolly when he was working on the Deniliquin Moama railway line near Hay. Clara's birth year can be narrowed down to 1852 to 1853 from her marriage and death records. I cannot definitively say who Clara's parents were. Her death certificate, in which her son Lewis was the informant, states that she was born in Tasmania in 1853, the daughter of unnamed Jolly and an unknown mother. However, when she married Charlie, she stated she was born at Newtown, Tasmania in 1852, but she named herself Clara Williams and stated her parents were George Williams, a sailor, and Clara Bansden. Clara stated her residence was Melbourne on the marriage certificate. Family trees have combinations of this information. I'm unable to find a birth record in Tasmania for a Clara Jolly or a Clara Williams. However, a Caroline Jolly was born on the 17th of May 1850 at O'Brien's Bridge. On this birth record it states that her father was George Jolly and her mother Elizabeth Jolly, formerly Bannister, and her father George Jolly was a constable. And George Jolly was the informant on the birth. On her first son's birth record, Clara again states her name as Clara Williams. Charles Lewis Lee married Clara on the 14th of March 1876 in East Melbourne at the Wesleyan Church. In 1885, Charlie purchased land, 698 acres, at Barubin in New South Wales, and he called it Park Estate. He sold chaff and oats to those in the district, and this became quite profitable for him as he was also doing his coach driving position at that time. Charlie and Clara had 11 children. The first child, Claude Roland Lee, was born at Taradale in Victoria on the 26th of June 1876. He married Edith Jane Maria Carter, who was 9 years younger than Claude, on the 7th of October 1909 at St Paul's Church of England, Deniliquin, when he was 33. He farmed in Deniliquin until 1923, when he was successful in a land ballot at Goodgowie, West New South Wales. Unfortunately, this venture was not successful, and the sheriff seized the property called Homestead Farm in May 1927. He's recorded as living back in Deniliquin in 1930. They then farmed near Nyngan before moving to Griffith, where Edith's parents lived. Claude died in July of 1946, aged 70, at the Bloomfield Mental Hospital in Orange, New South Wales. Claude had been committed several times in his life with mental health issues. He was sent to Callan Park Asylum in Sydney, aged only 16, and when he was 22 was committed to Kenmore Mental Hospital in Goulburn. Claude and Edith had 9 children. The second child, Arthur Herbert Lee, was born at Barubin, New South Wales in August 1877. He was known as Albert to the family. He married Elizabeth Robertson at Molagule in Victoria in 1902 when he was 25. He purchased a property that they called Park Lee at Mellon, a farming area between Moolameen in New South Wales and Swan Hill in Victoria. Arthur died in August 1919 of influenza at Swan Hill, aged only 42. Arthur and Elizabeth had 4 children, and the youngest child was only 1 when he died. The third child, Lewis Henry Lee, was born at Barubin, New South Wales in October 1878. He married Ella Milne in Echuca in 1918 when he was 40. Ella died only 4 years into their marriage at Wawilla Station, Wanganella, of pneumonia at 34 years. Lewis then married Lillian Adamson in 1925. She was 21 and Lewis was 47. They lived at Bulligal in 1929, where Lewis was a grazier and a hotel keeper. They moved to Deniliquin in 1941, and Lewis died in 1947 in Deniliquin, aged 68. Lewis and Lillian had one child, a daughter, Barbara, that was born in 1926 in Ballarat. The fourth child, Ada Lee, was born at Barooban, New South Wales in April 1880. She was my husband's great-great-grandmother. Ada married John Thomas Simpson on the 9th of March 1899 in Hay. John worked at Boabula, a property at Wanganella, as a boundary rider in 1903. By 1927, they moved to Deniliquin, where he was a drover, and they had 12 children. Ada died in Deniliquin in 1955, aged 75. Charles Lee, the fifth child, was born at Barooban in December 1882. He married Lexi Avenel Underwood at Avenel, Victoria, in October 1918 when he was 35 and Lexi 21. He managed the Park Estate property at Barooban after the death of his father. They lived in Deniliquin once he retired. They had 3 sons. The second son continued at Park Estate, and Charles died in Deniliquin in 1963, aged 80. Their sixth child, Clara Lee, was born at Barooban in 1884. She married James Henry Norris at her parents' home in April 1905 when she was 21 and James was 36. James had been born in Wanganella. They lived at Wanganella and had 10 children, and Clara moved into Deniliquin after the death of her husband and died there in 1952, aged 68. The seventh child, Benjamin Lee, was born at Barooban in March 1884. Benjamin was a grazier at the family's property when he enlisted in World War I on the 22nd of July 1916. He fought in France. He married Constance Sarah Townsing in Victoria in 1918. He was a storekeeper in 1929 and a mail contractor in 1930, both in Deniliquin. He then enlisted in World War II on the 1st of July 1941. He died in 1953 in Deniliquin, aged 69. They had 2 children. The eighth child, Sydney Ernest Lee, was born at Barooban, New South Wales in 1886. He married Annie May Dushka in 1916 in Dunkeld in Victoria. He owned the property Avenel at Wanganella and also was a licensee of the Wanganella Hotel in 1935. He died in Deniliquin in 1948, aged 62, and they had one son, Colin, who went ahead and ran Avenel. The ninth child, Hannah Muriel Lee, was born at Barooban in 1887. She was a nurse who worked at the Austin Hospital, Fairfield Hospital, and resided at Olney's Hotel when nursing in Geelong. In 1938, she became the manager of a maternal health centre in North Essendon and also ran the Town Hall Health Centre in Brunswick. She died in 1969 in Melbourne, aged 82, and she did not marry. George Edward Lee was born at Barooban in January 1890. He enlisted in World War I at Deniliquin in April 1915 and fought in France. He married Edith Isabel Ann Munro, who was born in Wanganella. They married in 1926 in Deniliquin when he was 36. Edith was 19. He owned a property called Fairview at Wanganella. They moved into Deniliquin in 1937, where he was an agent. He enlisted in World War II in the Home Guard in Deniliquin in May 1942, and he was a storekeeper at the time of his enlistment. He died in 1960 in Deniliquin, aged 70, and they had one son. Alice Maudley was born at Barooban, New South Wales in October 1891. She's the youngest of the family. She married Walter James Triffett at her parents' home in 1918 when she was 25 and Walter 28. In 1932, Walter and Alice ran the Wanganella store. Walter then managed the property Waterloo at Barooban. In 1954, they moved to Melbourne and lived in Brunswick, and Alice died in Brunswick in 1973, aged 82, and they had 3 children. Clara Lee died in Deniliquin on the 21st of May 1917, aged 64, at the residence of Mrs. Moheke in Cressy Street. And an article in the local paper has an obituary and it says, "A very old resident of the Barooban district, Mrs. Charles Lee of Park Estate, Barooban, died at Deniliquin on Monday morning. Mrs. Lee had been in indifferent health for some time. The deceased lady had spent almost all her lifetime in the district. She leaves a family of 7 sons, 2 of whom are on active service, and 3 daughters, 2 of whom are married. General sympathy will be felt for the bereaved husband and the family, especially by the older residents of the Riverina, who can remember the pioneering days, and by the residents of Berubin, who have often been entertained at the hospitable home at Park Estate. Charlie Lee died on the 23rd of January 1929 in North Deniliquin, aged 81, thought at the time to be the oldest resident in the district. And there's an article outlining his death. Old resident passes, Mr. Charles Lee dead. We regret to have to report the death of Mr. Charles Lee of Park Estate, Berubin, which sad event took place at the residence of his son at Deniliquin on Wednesday morning. The deceased gentleman, who was in his 88th year, had been in failing health for some months, and his death was not unexpected by his family. We know of no resident or settler who cannot say he was here when I came. He came to the Riverina under the engagement of Cobb Co, Robertson, Wagner and Co, to drive their mail coaches from Echuca to Hay. We do not know the exact date of his commencing with the great coaching firm, but it must have been in the very early 1860s. His main work was done between Hay and Deniliquin, and he was driving the mail coaches during the flood years of the late 60s and the great 1870 flood before there was a bridge at Hay. In 1868, the pastoralists of Deniliquin and Hay, at a meeting at Deniliquin, presented him with a gold watch and chain in recognition of the great work he did to maintain the mail communication during the floods of that and the previous year. The watch, which was a magnificent one and suitably inscribed, he wore for the rest of his life. Some years ago, in writing the history of the municipality of Hay in its Jubilee year, we were shown the report of that complimentary gathering, taken from the Deniliquin Chronicle of that period, and saw that the names of those present included most of the pioneers of the Deniliquin district, whose names are still treasured memories. Probably Mr. Lee himself was the last survivor of that gathering in 1868, meant to do honour to a man who had exhibited courage and resource under very trying circumstances. After the railway was opened to Deniliquin, Mr. Lee drove mostly on the Hay end of the line, and while doing so he met at Hay the lady who afterwards became his wife. Although he had very little spare time, he selected land at Berubin, which he farmed with the help of such assistance as he could secure. It was on the selected land that he made his home. In those days, every one of Cobb's horses between Hay and Deniliquin, which was used in the mail coaches, was corn-fed. The horses used in what were known as the day coaches, mainly used for the carriage of goods and services and excess luggage, were grass-fed, but the mail coach horses were stabled. A considerable quantity of chaff and oats was required for the purpose, and Mr. Lee supplied a good proportion of the feed used at the 16-mile gums, Pine Ridge, as Berubin was then called, Black Swamp and Wanganella. By dint of hard work, Mr. Lee made a success of his small holding, and as opportunity offered, he added to it. Although in later years he devoted his attention more to sheep, he never altogether discarded agriculture as an avenue of his activities. His property is well improved and is one of the most desirable small holdings in the district. Mr. Lee, during his long life, from practically nothing but his competent hands, got together a modest competency, and his experience is an example of what those may do who, by industrious application, devote themselves to the calling they take in hand. He was of a very generous disposition, and no appeal for a worthy object was ever made to him in vain. Although it is many years since Charlie Lee gave up coach driving, it is as a coach driver that he will be best remembered. He seldom had less than 6 horses to drive, and no more skilful driver ever handled the ribbons. Being of a quiet, unassuming nature, his name may not be as well known outside the district as those drivers who were more in the limelight, but the older residents who can remember the coaching days will think of him with the greatest respect. He was always reliable, always competent. In an age when a coach accident, if there were any suspicion of carelessness about it, invariably cost the firm of Cobb Co thousands of pounds, he never cost the firm a shilling. Not a few of the regular travellers were pleased when they found that they had struck Charlie's night to travel on. He was a great lover of horses and understood them well, which accounted to a great extent for his success. In May 1926, on the occasion of his 86th birthday, he attended a reunion of the old Cobb Co drivers and employees in Melbourne, but such was his unassuming character that he did not make himself at all prominent at that meeting, although he was the doyen of the gathering. Mrs. Lee predeceased her husband many years ago. They had a family of 11, of whom 10 survive. The sons include Mr. Lewis Lee, grazier and hotel keeper of Bullagul, Mr. Charles Lee Jr., who has managed Park Estate for some years, Mr. Sidney Lee, grazier of Wanganella, Mr. Ben Lee, storekeeper of North Deniliquin, Mr. George Lee, who is also a grazier at the Wanganella district, the daughters are Mrs. Simpson of North Deniliquin, Miss Hannah Lee, who is a trained nurse engaged at Geelong, Mrs. Norris of Wanganella, and Mrs. Trifford of Wanganella. 3 of his sons volunteered for active service, but only 2 of them, Ben and George, were accepted. The funeral of the deceased gentleman took place yesterday at Deniliquin. The body was taken to the Church of England, where a short service was conducted, and it was afterwards interred in the same grave as that of Mrs. Lee in the Church of England burial ground. And in his probate, it was advertised on the 25th of October 1929. Mr. Charles Lee of Park Estate, Barooban Grazier, who died at Deniliquin on January the 23rd, left estate in New South Wales valued at £29,844 and a personal property in Victoria of a gross value of £2,642 to his son Charles Lee, subject to gifts to other children, and bequests of £25 each to the Hay Hospital and St Paul's Pro Cathedral. So in the end, Charlie Lee was an industrious and giving man and managed to accrue quite a lot of money for those days that he could pass on to his family. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes